Well, hey, good morning, and welcome to part two of episode one of the Off the Cuff podcast. Episode one being what happens behind the scenes of an officer involved shooting. Hope everybody had a Merry Christmas. We're just about into 2026 here as we do this. We started this podcast as a way to try to educate the public on police related issues, maybe give them some behind the scenes looks at how and why certain things happen in our profession.
Yes, sir.
So, by way of introduction, my name's Ken. To my left is Frank in the middle
How we
and
doing?
Victor on the end.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
And we are three retired cops for the major city police department in the Southwest, specifically Phoenix PD, with a combined experience of, 75, 80 years.
Give or take.
Yeah. And we've got a lot of, between the three of us, we've got a lot of experience. We've done a lot of different things. So I think we bring a lot to the table when we talk about these topics. If you just stumbled on this episode, I would encourage you to go back and watch part one of the episode because it'll make a lot more sense. This was such a broad topic and so many moving parts that we had to kind of break it into two pieces. So catch part one, episode one, or you can just watch this and try to figure it out and keep up. But we're going to be jumping in the middle. So as a quick recap, in part one, we talked about what differentiates a murder from a justifiable homicide. The concept,
important.
what's that?
I said very important.
Yes, because a lot of people blend the two. They blend the two. The concept or idea of shoot to kill versus stopping the threat. Okay. And then specific laws governing use of force in law enforcement. Why the topic of why don't we see more cops being arrested? We talked about that in part one. So if you've always wondered about that, go catch part one.
Highly recommended.
Yeah, we talk about that. The chain of events that unfolds after a cop pulls the trigger. So there's a lot of things we talked about in part one, establishment of command and control, public safety statements, special resources that might be used, notifications that have to be made. Lots of notifications have to immediately occur. And then we talked about scene management and then the arrival of detectives and division of assignments. It's all very complex. A lot of things are happening fast and simultaneously. So with that, we'll jump into part two, and Frank's going to lead off with part two of episode one.
Let's get it, Frank.
All right. So once the scene has been stabilized and notifications have been made, one of the first things that will happen is the union representative will have notified a criminal defense attorney to come out to represent the officer. And it's twofold because it is a criminal investigation and the officer is a de facto suspect in a second-degree murder based on their actions.
Right.
They have to have representation by an attorney. So after conferring with the attorney, and of course you have attorney-client privilege, the officer either will give a statement or they won't give a statement based on the advice of the attorney. Now, vast majority of the times, a statement is given. However, we found out that with some of the other unions, such as LAPD, their policy is to advise the officer not to give a statement.
So now on that, Frank, I talked to some LAPD guys. This is a few years ago, so it's a bit dated. But when I talked to them a few years ago, some of their union guys, they said that was their policy then. I don't know if it's changed, but they said we automatically, our attorneys basically tell them to, quote, lawyer up. Don't give a statement to homicide investigators. So, and you're going to see variations between different agencies on how their legal representation chooses to handle that. So anyway, I just wanted to put that in there.
Right. And keep in mind that every agency is different. Every association is different. There's some agencies across the country. You get some of these smaller agencies and these little, you can call it a podunk town, where they might not even have that right, where they can have the opportunity to speak to an attorney.
I would imagine a lot of times in these smaller towns, you're not going to have an attorney come out to the scene. You're not going to have that legal advice. It's going to be you talking to your sergeant, trying to figure out what's the best thing for you.
Right.
If you're a new officer on with, like, say, 5 years or less, a lot of times officers automatically assume that if they pulled a trigger, that they did the right thing, and that they automatically assume that it'll be justified. And it's like, hey, we're all one happy team out here. You know what? And if I don't give a statement, it'll make me look bad.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So, and that's where I think people can fall into that trap with legal representation of not taking advantage of it. A lot of the bigger agencies, major city agencies, larger police unions, your union dues go to pay for those attorneys, and it's very important to have that resource and to utilize it. So anyway.
So as I said, they will confer. And then if the officer gives a statement to the criminal investigators, it's done in conjunction with what we call a walkthrough. And what they do is they walk through the scene and narrate or tell their account of what happened from the time they arrived up until when the use of deadly force, the shooting took place.
Yeah, and those scene walkthroughs can be somewhat lengthy. We all worked as union reps, and I think we've all three been on the scenes of critical incidents in various capacities.
Yeah.
Victor was also, you were a CISM guy too, right?
Yeah, correct.
And so Victor was often out there as a critical incident person to be there for the mental welfare of the officer, which is a whole different ball of wax.
Right. That's a whole other podcast. Right?
Yes, it is a whole nother topic. But some of these walkthroughs can be lengthy depending on how the shooting occurred. Sometimes it can be really quick because I jumped out of my car and within 60 seconds I shot the dude right there, and he's DRT, dead right there, right?
Yeah.
And
use a technical term.
Yeah.
I think when you guys say walkthrough, for a lot of people that maybe don't know exactly what you're talking about, but it's simply that. It's walking through the scene with investigators, with attorneys, and kind of giving a step-by-step, this is what I saw, this was my angle, these are more my thoughts and feelings about this incident, and kind of running down every single thing that was kind of going through your mind and those kinds of things step by step through the entire scene. So it can definitely be a lengthy process.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, the walkthroughs are super critical because you want that officer to express what were you feeling? What were you seeing? We want to examine lighting conditions. We want to examine weather conditions. We have the crime scene people out there photographing the scene to try to capture the essence of all of that. So that they can get as accurate a reflection as possible from what that officer was experiencing.
Right. Now, keep in mind that while this investigation, the criminal investigation, is going on, there's also a simultaneous administrative investigation, which basically is to determine whether or not the officer's actions comported with department policies on use of force, use of deadly force. So the internal affairs, or what we know as Professional Standards Bureau, those investigators are able to go through the walkthrough and they get their information for their investigation from the walkthrough.
Realistically, what's happening when a shooting happens, there's a lot of folks out at the scene, right? I mean, you got all kinds of investigators. You have homicide investigators. You have officers with the perimeter and helping with other things like that. And there's just a lot of folks on scene, a lot of, circled conversations, the officer with his attorneys, those kinds of things. And there's a lot of folks that are involved in this.
And not only that, Victor, that's a great point, but not only that, you can still have an active search going on for suspects still outstanding. You could have helicopters overhead, search teams out, canine teams, SWAT guys out, patrol guys, these scenes, I used to refer to it as orchestrated chaos.
Yeah.
To a person that walks out there, it looks like total chaos, but for the cops, we kind of understand what's going on.
And it's always dark 30, right? So.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe raining.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only, cold day in Phoenix too, right? That's usually what happens.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, getting back to the investigation now, if the officer decides that they're not going to speak to the criminal investigators, that's when IA, PSB can step in and they can do a compelled interview to get the story of what happened. And when you do a compelled interview, it's a condition of employment. You
Right.
have to give that interview or you can be terminated. And with that comes the application of what we call Garrity Rights. And I'll go ahead and I'll defer to Ken.
Yeah, so Garrity
take care of
Rights,
that.
Garrity Rights is a real interesting concept, and most citizens have probably never heard of it. And here's what we'll tell you, being union guys that have represented officers, most officers have never heard of Garrity Rights.
Absolutely.
Until they're sitting in the hot seat in an IA interview, and we put this thing in, the union guy says, hey, these are your Garrity Rights. When we go on tape, you're going to read these verbatim prior to doing the interview. So what is this thing called Garrity? Well, there's two key Supreme Court cases that came down in 1967. One was Garrity versus New Jersey. The other was called Spivak versus Klein. So I want to just give you some bullet points on both of these because it's kind of interesting, really. So Garrity, let's take Garrity v. New Jersey first.
Oh, it's a Jersey thing, huh?
Yeah, it was a Jersey thing, of course. So this was spawned by a 1961 investigation by the New Jersey State AG into allegations of ticket fixing in the townships of Belmar and Barrington, New Jersey. So Chief Edward Barrington, it's always got to be a chief, right?
Imagine.
We jest, okay? And 5 other officers were interviewed as a part of the investigation. They were read their rights. Well, some of the officers, you read anybody their rights, or especially a cop, they're like, hey, I might be in big trouble here.
And I was going to say, Ken, that a lot of times when you're out there on one of these incidents, it's just kind of part of doing the job, right? But when everybody gets there and then you get set in a room and they start talking about rights and you see the Garrity Rights, it's sometimes the first time you start feeling like, what the heck?
Yeah,
this is serious.
Yeah, this is going to be a big deal.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
What did I just get involved in?
Exactly.
So anyway, these guys are read their rights. Some didn't want to talk. And so some of the officers said, I don't know if I want to do this interview. So then they're told, well, if you don't talk, we're going to fire you. So the officers then, under threat of termination, agreed to be interviewed. But then the evidence from these compelled interviews were then used to fire them and used for prosecutorial purposes.
Wow.
So they took it to court. The lower courts upheld the firing of the officers, and the New Jersey Supreme Court later affirmed that decision. They said, we don't think they did anything wrong. You could be fired.
Makes sense.
So in 1967, it gets heard by the Supreme Court, which was the Warren Court at the time. And here's what I found interesting. The Supreme Court reversed the lower court's decision in a 5-4 ruling. That was a squeaker. I mean, by one vote, the court said that, you can't hold a club over somebody's head and threaten to fire them if they don't interview you, and then later use that information gleaned for prosecution. So, incidentally, there was a case that happened in New York City. There's an attorney by the name of Samuel Spivak who was employed by the New York State Bar Association and was facing disbarment. So Spivak was ordered to produce financial records and testify at a judiciary hearing. And the other attorney on the flip side was an attorney named Solomon Klein, and he was wrapped up in it because he was the chief counsel to the Judiciary Inquiry on Professional Conduct of the New York State Supreme Court. That's a mouthful.
Digest that for a moment.
So Spivak refused to produce the requested records and asserted his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. So the state bar then said, well, we're going to charge you with professional misconduct. And it was ordered that he be disbarred by the appellate division of the New York State Supreme Court.
Holy cow.
That's not good.
And no. And so then it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court overruled the lower court and said disbarment was inappropriate, citing violations of his Fifth Amendment rights. So moving forward, attorneys were allowed to assert their Fifth Amendment rights when under investigation. Now, here's what's interesting about these cases. You see the interesting parallels. One involves cops, one involves attorneys. both instances, we have people being threatened with loss of employment because you're not going to give us a statement. How dare you assert your constitutional right to remain silent? Who do you think you are?
Everybody else has that right. I mean, why wouldn't they have the right?
Sure. Both of these cases were heard on the very same day in 1967 by the U.S. Supreme Court. And some attorneys believe it was by design because they so closely paralleled each other in the situation of what happened to these cops and this attorney, Spivak. So they ruled basically the same on both cases. And in Garrity, what they said was government employees cannot be compelled to give statements under threat of job forfeiture with these same statements being used against the person for criminal prosecution. So that case in 67 those two cases were landmark Supreme Court cases that tie into now when a cop is accused of misconduct, if they go in front of internal affairs, they can say, I'm invoking my Garrity rights. In other words, I understand I'm being compelled to talk to you guys, and if I don't, that you're probably going to fire me. So under threat of job forfeiture, I'll go ahead and give you an interview and give you the answers to the questions. But you can't take any of this stuff in this room that I give you. You cannot turn around and go down the hall to the criminal guys and hand it all to them so they can build a criminal case against me. So
exactly, because you'd be able to exercise your constitutional rights in any other type of, shape, form, or manner.
Right.
Just like anybody else, but because you're being compelled, hey, don't use that information against me. I'm forced to give this statement. It's almost like torture.
Yeah. In a manner of speaking, correct. Yeah.
Very, very unique set of rules.
Yeah. I thought it was really interesting as you were saying it. In fact, I looked up on my phone real quick, but I remember the Arizona case, the Miranda rights, right?
Correct.
And that wasn't until like 66, 67. So you're talking about some cases where in 61, reading their rights, right? At some point in time, they had some kind of a semblance of rights, but it wasn't actually official until like 67, and which is the timing of some of this. So very interesting. And
so
close Arizona tie.
So we had rights, but I think with the Miranda case, it compelled the reading of rights.
Yeah.
So the rights were always there, and some agencies did utilize them. And I think in the Garrity case, because it was cops and potential corruption, to cover their backsides, they probably advised them of their rights, even though it was, like you said, it wasn't compelled by the Miranda case until later on. Yeah, interesting point.
Yep.
So,
all right. So now that we understand what Garrity rights are, we'll go back to what we were talking about with the investigations. So as I said, you have two concurrent investigations, criminal and administrative, and we'll talk a little bit about why they have that. One of the things with the criminal investigation is that you will have a representative from the county attorney's office come out. And again, it may vary in your state. It may be a county attorney. It may be a district attorney. Every state is
Solicitor General back east
on how they have their justice system set up. But the job of the county attorney is for the sole purpose of reviewing facts and evidence immediately available, and they're going to decide whether or not an officer is going to be arrested.
Right. And an interesting point on that, Franklin, is that when you're out on these scenes and you see, let's say the officer says, yes, I'm going to give a statement to criminal investigators. It's going to be homicide guys, homicide detectives. That county attorney or their designee that's out there is going to be doing that walkthrough right along with those detectives, listening to everything that officer says.
Right.
The officer is also going to have their union defense attorney attached to their hip as well. So it's a cluster of people doing this it's a little entourage doing this walkthrough. But everybody's listening really closely to what's being said.
Right.
So
there's an occasional grabbing a shoulder or an arm and kind of like, hey, don't go down that road. Don't talk about that. Move on.
Or it could be
keep it short.
Or it could even be, don't answer that question.
Yeah, absolutely.
It could be that direct by the defense counsel. Yeah.
So the involved officers are going to have full-length photographs taken of all four sides. This way they can document the condition that their uniform was in. In a lot of these instances, a police shooting will result after a prolonged physical struggle.
Right.
The officer could potentially have injuries. So that's what the purpose of the photographs is to document what they look like. And again, if there's torn clothing, so on and so forth, what type of uniform were they wearing?
Right.
Were they in a traditional patrol uniform? Were they in maybe quasi plain clothes?
Was it a detective?
Right.
Yeah.
Did they have plain clothes on? Did they have a vest? Were they clearly identified as officers?
Right. And tied in with that, another reason they do that, it's important to document, but we've seen shootings where part of the defense crafted by a suspect and their defense counsel is, I didn't know it was a cop.
Right.
And that's what they're trying to get off, used to get off the hook.
Additionally, firearms that are used in the shooting, whether it's a handgun, rifle, shotgun, they will be collected into evidence. They will count the rounds that are in the magazines to determine how many shots were fired by the officer, because in a lot of these instances, the officer may simply not remember how many shots they fired.
Yes.
Because they were more concerned with saving their life or saving the life of another than counting rounds.
Yeah, officers rarely exactly remember how many they shot unless it was a situation where the officer pulled their gun and fired one shot.
Correct.
That's the easy one. But we see discrepancies in memory all the time, and it's a naturally occurring thing. And back in the day, people used to say, "Oh, you're lying."
Right.
No, it's just that memory is this fickle beast, and under stress, and the chemicals released into the bloodstream, your attentional resources are being focused on saving your life, not figuring out how many times the gun went bang. So yeah,
exactly. And that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah,
we can get into it at some point in time. And then, of course, when they collect the officer's firearm to be taken into evidence, they're going to issue them a replacement, and generally, it's going to be the same model, same caliber. So
right.
They have a firearm, and then eventually, after the case is resolved, they will get their firearm back.
Correct. Yeah, those guns have to go to the lab. They do a complete workup on them. They test them. They make sure they're functioning properly. They look to see if any alterations were made, unauthorized alterations were made to the gun. If an officer dropped in some, super light trigger, that could be problems, because a lot of departments will have approved alterations you can make.
Right.
But then it's got to stop at that point. So, yeah.
Well, typically what'll happen post-shooting is the officer, it's not the fun part, but the officer will get assigned a home, administrative leave, typically. Sometimes that leave will go on for about 3 weeks. And I've actually seen it go on for a lot longer than that. If you had an officer that maybe was involved in several critical incidents, they may not want him to be on the front lines for quite a while, because they may have some, 1-2 investigations under review, county attorney, some use of force boards, those types of things. So a lot of times the officer's at home or has a non-enforcement type duty station that he's been assigned to. Typically the academy is where they put a lot of people, and it's typically a good assignment for folks because they can, take their head out of the game a little bit and relax and not be in a tense environment. But truthfully, a lot of the officers don't like to, be sat down. They want to get back to work. They want to get on their squad. They want to do all the things. But
well, yeah, Victor, and tied in with that, I think we're doing a lot better job now. A lot of agencies are doing. I know Phoenix is. I can't speak to every agency out there, but back in the day, being pulled off the street, they might put you in some very undesirable detail, and it was almost like a punishment timeout. So I think we saw a 180 where they said, look, got in a shooting, it sucks, but you know what? You did what you had to do. And it was beyond your control, which in most cases it is. It's beyond the officer's control. And so what we saw in Phoenix was they would say, listen, we got to put you in a non-enforcement detail for a few weeks. We don't want you out on the street right away. Let you decompress. But we're still giving you a paycheck. We got to get
Yeah.
some work out of you.
Yeah.
So, like you said, put them at the academy in a training environment where they can help out doing training for recruits. Or the other thing I've seen is they'll go, hey, what kind of detective detail on the department are you really interested in? Oh, well, uh, I, homicide, sex crimes, robbery, okay, I tell you what, we'll plug you in over robbery for the next month, and you can shadow those guys and help them out and kind of learn a little. So that, I think, it was really a win-win when the agency started doing that.
Yeah, and I'll say I work with one of the agencies in the Valley now, and if they have any kind of critical incident, they usually make a determination, and sometimes that officer will actually get 30 days off. And they'll recommend for them to go see a psychiatrist, psychologist, a counselor, and those kinds of things. But, in an officer shooting, typically the officer's going to see a psychiatrist at least 2 times, right?
Correct.
Right.
They'll do an initial where they will see the psychiatrist, and psychiatrists will do their typical rundown of questionnaire and assessments and those kinds of things. And it's typically not an entire like fit for duty type of situation, but it's typically a pretty intense assessments and taking a look at the officer and seeing how he's doing that. And then usually, typically right before they get back on the street, they'll have to go back and see a psychiatrist and really get kind of cleared for duty again and those kinds of things.
So, and this is interesting, Vic, and this is your wheelhouse, the psychiatric portion, the mental health stuff is kind of where you've got a lot of expertise, but is there a connection between like a month off and PTSD symptoms?
Well, typically when you're talking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress, for those
Sure.
folks out there that don't know what that is, but typically in the first 30 days, you might be experiencing some symptoms like sleeplessness, avoidance. In other words, you don't want to drive in the area of the city where the shooting occurred, something like that. You might experience some nightmares, flashbacks, those types of things. And if being a counselor, if somebody came to see me in those first 30 days and they're experiencing that, it is not PTSD, because PTSD criteria has to be over a 30-day period. So you would have had to have the distress for at least 30 days to be diagnosed with PTSD. So within the first 30 days, there's a diagnosis called acute stress. So the same symptoms that I actually just talked about, you could be diagnosed with acute stress. And but typically with PTSD, you wouldn't see that till 30 days and out. Typically within 90 days, you see it. But I'll tell you, I've seen some officers where they've been involved in incidents 3, 5, 8, 10 years back, where then they're now just experiencing some of the symptoms and distress from PTSD, which sounds really odd, but the truth is it's kind of like an accumulative stress, right?
Right.
Where there's been maybe a trigger incident, right? And it could be something like a divorce, a car accident, maybe somebody else involved in a shooting and they hear about it, and all of a sudden they're triggered back to the trauma that they experienced, and they get overwhelmed and, come in and see me, and we start talking about trauma therapy and some of those kinds of things.
Yeah, and it could be tied in with that. You could have an officer, you talk about triggering events. It could be the 3 of us on an event, and you pull the trigger, and I'm right there as backup, and I don't pull the trigger, but I'm witnessing all of this. And then all of a sudden, a day later, I get this cascade, this mental cascade that goes on in my head, and I'm like, what the heck's going on,
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, has, thousands of diagnostic criteria and diagnoses in there for PTSD, all kinds of other things. But if you look at, for instance, bipolar, schizophrenia, no one knows what causes those things, right? But when you look at PTSD, it says right in there, we know exactly what causes it. And it's acute stress, it's being exposed to traumatic scenes, it's being involved in traumatic events, those kinds of things. So I would say in this day and age, it's one of those things that maybe not completely expected, but it's probably something you're going to see within your police career.
Right.
And I guess the best if there is a silver lining to it, is that agencies have actually become more aware of it
Yeah.
over the years, and now they're providing resources to officers to help them through it. Because back in the day, it was like, all right, and I've talked to some of we've all talked to the old timers where they were involved in a shooting, and few hours later, they're back on shift, back to
Yeah.
what they were doing. And now you think about it, it's like, you
Absolutely.
wouldn't even think about that.
Yeah, there's some agencies that are really doing a good job with that in the Valley these days, and I can name a few. I think Tempe Police Department's doing a fantastic job right now in what they do for the officers. They've got the Craig Tiger Act now that came out of Phoenix, obviously,
Right.
Correct.
with Craig Tiger and his unfortunate death as a result of PTSD and unaddressed trauma and those kinds of things. But in the state of Arizona, you can basically claim the Craig Tiger Act, and you are guaranteed under state law that you get 32 sessions, no questions asked. And typically, you can actually get your time off of work while you do those 32 sessions. So you could be off of work,
Compensated time.
compensated, and
Yeah.
and off work for quite a while.
Yeah, and you know what? And to be honest, I don't know. You'd know better than me, but I think it's probably rare that somebody actually needs that. But it's nice to know that it's codified in law that if somebody does really get kind of mentally screwed up, that amount of help is available, and will be paid for.
Yeah, we're talking about rights and Garrity rights, Miranda rights, and all that. And I mean, this is a right,
Mhm.
right? And unfortunately, a lot of times there's a price that's paid for people to have some of these rights. And some very good people died as a result of trauma that was
Unaddressed. Yeah.
that they, earned while at work. And so it's a very good thing that's happening across Arizona, across America.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So officers typically, like with Phoenix, they have to meet with a tactical review committee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've got to meet with tactical review committee. Usually, as at least in Phoenix, we have a tactical review committee, but usually there's people that are on like a squad that has to do with the creation of tactics and monitoring the tactics and putting into policy the tactics, and they make sure that the officer did everything according to policy, those kinds of things. They review it, then they send it to the incident review board or the tactical review committee,
Mm-hmm.
and they take a look at it and make sure that the officer did everything right and so on and so forth. And if the officer did some things maybe that weren't perfect or right, they might send them to some additional training
Right.
and those kinds of things to make sure that like they're up to par with the policy and procedures say that they need to be.
Yeah, and I don't know if Phoenix is still doing this. Before I retired, one of the things they would do is have the involved officers at a point, maybe weeks or a couple months after an event, come down to the academy, and the academy guys by then would have dissected the event, the shooting or whatever it was, and would have as much evidence as possible. But then they would sit down with the involved officer or officers to say it was kind of just a tactical debrief and to say, hey, look, and it wasn't about beating people up so much as it's like, well, now that we have a chance to kind of cool off, think about things, it's like, here's what we see. Here's what we think could have been done better. Here's courses of action that might have let you possibly avoid this situation. Or, you know what? And sometimes it might be, it sucked to be you that day, but you handled it textbook. And we don't have a lot to add to it, And but like you said, sometimes there's remedial training. So
Yeah, typically the remedial training would happen. You would requalify with your firearms. You would typically go through some types of simulation with firearms as well. In Phoenix, used to be called FATS, and they got a newer system, obviously, they've been working on a long time. But
Right.
But you would typically see some scenarios, and it'd be shoot, don't shoot type of scenarios, just to make sure that you're in alignment with what you should be doing now, and your mental health is clear, and you can make the right decisions. And that's a pass fail too. It's not you got 80%, you only shot one guy that you shouldn't have. It's a pass fail. You got to do it exactly right every time, or you're not going through.
Yeah, what's interesting is we had a guy that worked in the union office for a number of years, and prior to that, he had worked at the department's firearms detail. And he would get these people that would come out that had been involved in shootings. And he told me that one of the things he would do is he would, we had these photorealistic targets. We call them bad guy targets. But, you know, they kind of come in every color, shape, and size. You'd have photo targets of bad guys that are white, bad guys that are black, bad guys that are Latino, Asian, female, you know. And
people holding babies, all that kind of stuff.
A knife, a gun, whatever. And he said one of the things he liked to do was he'd tell people and go, I want you to go to those targets and pick out the one that most closely resembles the person you shot and go put it up. And they would run drills. And what he was looking for was to see if there was hesitation, because that could be a triggering event where somebody they might have a little mini breakdown and go, I can't do this. Well, you better figure that out before you put them back on the street.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, the
other good thing that comes out of these tactical reviews is development, not only for looking at the policy itself, but are there improvements that could be made to the policy? And then also, when it comes to in-service training, we had an officer that was in this particular situation, and it's maybe the first time it's come up, but other officers need to be aware of it so then they can develop force-on-force training scenarios that they can incorporate into in-service training.
Correct.
So that the officers know that, hey, this is a possibility.
Right.
So we're training for the future and better preparing the officers for what they can ultimately face on the street.
Yeah. And do you guys remember when some kind of a shooting would happen and you would hear about it, you would hear kind of word on the street that there was a couple of issues with the shooting, and about 3-4 months later, you'd be down at the academy doing a whole new training regiment to make sure that what that person did and made a mistake doing, that we've trained it out of us, and they'll put us through scenarios, make sure that you're not duplicating the same actions.
Yeah. It was exposure training, and it's like, okay, this is, and not to bag on the officer that got in the shooting, but I think the trainers and department recognize this could be an issue. Let's build a scenario around this. And to that, I'll give a plug to Virtuous Simulation Systems out in Chandler. It used to be in Tempe. I think they're in Chandler now. But Virtuous got these state-of-the-art simulators. I know Phoenix PD has one. A lot of agencies around the state of Arizona have them, but they're I think, a 270-degree simulator. You step up on a stage, but they can do amazing stuff with those simulators. I know years ago, Tempe had a real controversial shooting, and they went right out to the scene where that shooting, and they filmed a scenario at that scene using actors, and they could put officers right into that same scene in a simulation, and very, very realistic. And the computers that they use and the video, HD video that they have slaved to that system, just, phenomenal. Now they're getting into the VR stuff where you wear a headset. It's just amazing technology.
Full 360 degrees training environment.
Yeah, and you can implement the use of shotguns, carbines, pistols, pepper spray, tasers, even flashlights, where it'll be nighttime, but if you use your Vertra flashlight, it'll actually light the screen up like you're shining a flashlight. I mean, it's pretty
far cry from the training that I received in the academy in 1989, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it was a part of the post-shooting stuff that happens. One of the things that we want to get into is the internal investigation phase. And again, different agencies will handle this differently. Back in the day on Phoenix, when we were all out there showing up at these scenes and repping officers, homicide would be in one van, internal affairs would be in another van. And if they did a walkthrough with homicide, which could take a couple hours, maybe, sometimes.
Depending on the complexity in the scene, sure.
Sure. And then they'd come back and they would get handed immediately off to internal affairs guys. And at that point, as a union rep, we could jump in because our criminal defense attorney would accompany them with the criminal investigation walkthrough. Then when they handed off to internal affairs, then the union guys would step up. We could go in the van and sit there as their union rep while they were being interviewed. Now, before we left, at least before I left, retired, they kind of, in Phoenix, they kind of changed the way they did it. And so if the officer agreed to do a walkthrough of the criminal investigators, then the IA investigators were allowed to kind of walk along during that scene walkthrough. So think of Garrity as a one-way check valve. Information can only flow one way. If an officer or their attorney says, I don't think it's a good idea for you to talk to criminal, then what would happen is internal affairs would step up and do a compelled interview / walkthrough, but none of that information would flow to criminal.
Right.
As long as they had agreed to do one with criminal, then IA could accompany on that walkthrough and start harvesting some info. So what we saw later on is IA would say, look, we'll call you down to IA in about a week to do your IA interview, because it's just administrative in nature, okay? They're not doing a criminal investigation. So by then they had some really good sleep, maybe 5, 6, 7 sleep cycles under their belt. They'd kind of recovered from the event. And we know from the way human memory works that really the best time to interview somebody after a critical incident is 48 to 72 hours, because it allows memory to coalesce and sort out what happened and kind of put the pieces back in order. And so what we found is waiting a week, a lot of our officers would give really, really good, cogent interviews, whereas the night of, when they're at the tail end of a 10-hour shift, and now we're going to go into another 8 hours on top of that, post-shooting, where they've been stressed out. Some of those interviews were more like alphabet soup, and so we learned some lessons from that. But the focus of an IA investigation is really to concentrate on whether any of the involved officers violated departmental policies. And a lot of times they focus on use of force policies. Did you follow your department's policies on use of force? Was the force reasonable and proportionate and all that stuff? And did you use proper techniques and tactics? And they'll get into stuff like that. But they also get into a lot of administrative stuff. So once that's all wrapped up, eventually a critical incident review board will be convened. Back in our day, we call it a use of force board. And so keep in mind, there's 2 parallel track investigations. There's criminal, internal administrative. The criminal, all they're trying to figure out is, are we going to charge you with a homicide? Right? Manslaughter charge, So the county attorney or the DEA or whoever you have in your jurisdiction, they're working that angle along with homicide investigators or the shooting team investigators. But the Critical Incident Review Board, they convene, and in Phoenix, last time I checked, it was chaired by an assistant chief. There's a commander on the board, a peer officer, and 3 civilians. And, but they also, in an advisory capacity, they had a firearms unit training sergeant that would be there, a non-lethal force supervisor, and a member of the Phoenix Police Department legal unit would be there. And they were there in an advisory capacity. They usually sat in there and didn't say anything unless somebody raised a question that they needed to specifically address as an expert or subject matter expert.
Right.
The involved officers would attend. Now, some of these use of force boards, you could have 4 officers showing up. You might have a shooting scene where 4 officers pulled the trigger, right? And but the involved officer or officers would show up, and along with their union representatives. So this was kind of unique, at least in our department, because this was one of the only times the union rep could be an active participant, in that you might have an officer that will run to a gunfight without hesitation every day of the week, but you put them in a room full of police department brass in a formal hearing setting, and they're like, I don't think I can do this. Well, okay, I'll talk for you. That's my job.
Right.
You know, I'll do a presentation. I'll speak on your behalf. So we are allowed to do that. But the IA supervisors would be there, and they would give just a very black and white, unvarnished, I call it the Joe Friday dragnet, just the facts, man presentation. You know, on this date and this time, Officer so-and-so was patrolling in the vicinity of XYZ Street when he made a traffic stop, and upon exiting his vehicle, he was engaged by a suspect that fired a gun, you know. And it was just that laid out vanilla, no opinions put in, and they might have a little slideshow showing
PowerPoint.
crime scene photos so that the panel could get a better visualization. And understand, prior to this, the panel, if you sat on a use of force panel, you were allowed to go down to our internal affairs 3 weeks ahead of time, and they would put you in a room and give you the investigation so that you could read and review it before you ever sat in that room to deliberate, you know, the day of the board. So the IA presents what happened in a very black and white fashion, and then the involved officers were allowed, and or their union rep were allowed to present to the board to say, here's what happened from my perspective. And I think that was very valuable to have, because when you hear it from the involved officer, you know, you're going to get the emotion, you're going to get the feelings. I saw this, I heard this, you know, this happened, I fell to the ground, shots were being fired, you know, yada, yada. And after that is over, then the board is usually allowed to ask clarifying questions. And man, I've heard some real Lulus.
Welcome to the club.
Sitting on a use of force board with the citizens. I mean, and I'm all for citizen involvement. I think it's a good thing to have. But just the train of thought that some of these citizens have about what they think the police should be able or should have done can be astounding at times. And so,
I mean, it's such a complex environment, along with the very fact that the nature of the business and all the training, everything that happens within the police department, and then you get a citizen that has very little information, I guess, about how things work. And so I think a lot of times their questions are very simply put, but typically miss the mark. And I think, like you said, like, I'm not against citizens on the review board, but I would think that typically if you could be on a review board for quite a while, you can probably get a pretty good idea how things are running.
right.
And you'd be a little bit better in that board to ask good clarifying questions and really get a good understanding of what's happening.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think a good analogy is citizens that are asked to serve on grand juries are often asked to serve for 6 months. So when you're going down a few days a week to hear grand jury, in the beginning, it's going to be a rough ride. You're not going to know which way's up. But by months 2 and 3 and moving forward, you're going to understand a lot of stuff about law enforcement and police procedure, and your questions will get better and be more well-informed. But I can remember one case I had on, it was a shooting where an officer and a sergeant outside of a precinct had to shoot a guy that was hurling river rocks. You know, a legit shoot, justifiable shoot. The county attorney said, we're not going to charge this case. That was a righteous shoot. So criminally, they're out of the woods, right? But now it's a use of force. You know, we're in there. And I remember to this day, one of the citizens, you know, and I'm representing the officer, and the sergeant had his own supervisor union rep, you know, for his board. But I remember this one said, well, didn't you think at a point maybe you should have gone back into precinct to the equipment locker to grab some tear gas? And I'm just like, I was starting to get up out of my chair to respond, and the chief of the board, who I knew, said, "Can I address this later offline?" And I'm like, "Okay." Just the mere thought that it's like, okay, we can go into a precinct and we got this big equipment locker with all these toys and tear gas and all, and tear gas would have been totally irrelevant because it was a rapidly unfolding scene that had to be addressed right then and there. But this is just sometimes the way people think, and it's totally outside the realm of reality.
Well, let me throw a curveball in there because, again, you would generally expect that from citizens, from the public, because they're not familiar with the procedures. But I recall a specific use of force board where one of the peer officers asked a question, then I was absolutely floored, and it was to the effect of, well, knowing what you know now, would you still have done what you've done?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had to sit there like, are you kidding me?
Right. That was a favorite question. And we used to see questions like that coming out of police administrators. And by that, I mean police commanders, assistant chiefs, and chiefs, because they wanted the officer, if they thought the officer did something wrong, they wanted him to show contrition.
Right.
And it was like, well, knowing what you know now, what would you have done?
I came into work. I would have just taken the night off.
Yeah, I would have dropped the BV slip.
Well, that's what I started telling my guys. I go, if they ask you this question, tell them, yeah, I would have put in a leave slip and stayed home playing video games or something, because, and this is exactly, it speaks to the heart of the 1989 case, of use of force case, landmark, Graham v. Connor, where the court goes, you cannot judge an officer based on the 20/20 vision of hindsight. But yet we still see cops at all levels and police administrators in these review panels that want to do exactly that. And it just floors me when I hear when I heard that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But moving it along, once the officer, they ask questions and there's no more questions, they would clear the room so the panel could deliberate in private. And then you would be called back in, and they would say, well, the board's deliberated, and they have found that your use of force was in policy. Now, this is where it gets a little political, because the board's recommendation is forwarded to the police chief, and the chief can do a couple of things. The chief can go, I don't like it. I'm going to overturn it. I'm going to find it out of policy, right? So the chief is the final arbiter. And this is where you get these cases that might have been political hot potatoes, got a lot of media attention, negative media attention. Maybe there's people out there, activist groups, kind of waiting to see what happens. And so now we have officers that might get served up on what I call the altar of political correctness. We need a sacrificial lamb, and you're it. Sorry. Because
we don't want to riot tonight. So
correct.
Sorry.
Correct. And that stuff really does happen.
Oh, absolutely.
On police departments around the nation. Officers will often get hung out to dry because it just looked bad. And you've got a chief that's either weak in the knees or a chief that's getting tremendous pressure from the mayor or city manager or city council calling for somebody's head. And so
I would just say I've seen this a lot, and with many meetings with supervisors in some of these closed rooms, a lot of times they will tell you that we shouldn't have done what we did, that whether it's between policy and there's nothing clear-cut that says you couldn't do it, you should not have done it. And we always ask the question, how should we have acted in this particular situation? And they almost always say the same thing. Well, I'm not going to tell you what you should have done. I'm just telling you shouldn't have done this.
What you shouldn't have done.
Yeah.
What you shouldn't have done was wrong.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, but if you as an administrator can't tell me what I should have done, then screw you, with all due respect. I mean, that's a political cop out, and I saw that a lot too. But the chief can either go with what the board recommends. Okay, the board found it in policy. What that what that board does, it removes the chief from the process and it gives them a little bit of political cover. It's like, look, we sent it to a review board that has 3 civilians sitting on it. They reviewed all the evidence available, the video, the audio, photos, read reports. They got to read everything. They got to ask questions of the officer and hear it from the officer and hear from internal affairs. And they came to this finding that it was within policy. I'm going with the board. And so now we've also seen on more rare occasions where the board found somebody out of policy.
Mm-hmm.
The beef I had on the way our boards ran back in the day, I don't know if they changed it, but I made an argument before I left. I told one of our assistant chiefs, I said, listen, if you want to find them out of policy, that's your business. I don't care. I said, but at least before the officer leaves this room, tell them what policy you believe they violated. I said, you should at least be able to give them that, because all too often it was like, well, we just don't like it.
Right.
We think there might have been other options. And I said, at least tell them, cite a policy violation. And what they would do is they would roll it up to the 4th floor and go, we think so. And then they would take 3 more weeks to comb through the book, the 1,300-page book, and go, oh, this looks good. That looks good. We'll cite these policies. And we think that's what you violated. If you can't tell me the day of, there's something wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
And
instead of using some catch-all policy.
And I mean, the truth about it is use of force can be ugly. It's never pretty. And there's always gray matter, so to speak, no pun intended, involved in the middle of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's never clear cut. And you have to look at the intent and all those other things to figure out whether or not, what was the nature, what were they trying to accomplish, what was going on. And it becomes very interesting.
Yeah. But let's say an officer's found out a policy. And sometimes the out of policy findings are legit. And there's been times where I've repped officers and I've told them going in, it's like, look, and I've told them, I said, listen, they're going to find you out of policy. Because by then I had reviewed the whole investigation. I had gone through our ops orders. I had gone through the use of force policy. And I'm like, okay, I think they're going to ding you on this and this. Just get ready for it. Okay. And a lot of times that's what would happen. So if you're found out of policy, the next phase in the process would be a disciplinary review board.
Right. So the disciplinary review board, the way we used to refer to it in the union office was it was the sentencing hearing, because you were found
assumed to have been guilty.
Yeah, you were assumed guilty of a policy violation, and now we're going to determine what gets to happen to you. And the way it works, it's very similar to the critical incident review board or the use of force board, where you have a panel and there are civilians. And basically the officer, it's the same thing. They do a presentation. This was the investigation. This is where we found. The officer did this, 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 and this. The officer will get to tell their side of the story. And in a lot of instances, yeah, I made a mistake. I was wrong. I regret what I did. And you kind of accept your punishment or your discipline and move on. Now, I had one where the officer was found out of policy at the use of force board. So they sent it to the disciplinary review board. And it happened to be, it was a dynamic situation. There was a lot going on that in the chain of events that led my officer to be involved in this use of force. And so the interesting thing was they decided that they were going to give the officer a suspension. That was the discipline for violating the policy. But they wanted the use of force board to take a second look at the use of force, because they felt that the use of force board didn't get it right, that it was a bad decision for the use of force board. And my gut feeling was to say, well, if you think it needs to go back to the use of force board, why are we issuing discipline?
Right.
But, being the professional that I was, it's like, okay, we'll deal with it. And eventually what happened, it went back to a second use of force board. Second use of force board found the officer in policy, and henceforth no discipline. Now, getting back to the actual disciplinary review board, so they will go by what we call the matrix, and they will look at, okay, so for this policy, this is what the options of discipline are. And it can be anything from a written reprimand all the way up to 240-hour suspension or termination. And once the disciplinary review board has reached their judgment, the officer has options. And if they believe that the discipline is too harsh, they can appeal it going through what we call a civil service board,
Right.
which is a whole nother thing. And they could potentially have the discipline reduced, and so instead of a 240-hour suspension, maybe you'll get a 40-hour suspension. Instead of a suspension, you might get a written reprimand. Instead of a termination, you could potentially get a very heavy suspension. So
Yeah. And you know what, I remember part of our city personnel rules were if you got a suspension of 8 hours or less, you could not appeal it. So it had to be 16, and they'd usually give out suspensions of blocks of 8 hours. Back in the day, it would be 16 hours, 8, 16, 24, 32. And you could go all the way up to 240 was the max, which is 6 weeks off without pay. And then the only thing greater than that would be termination for a really egregious violation. But I saw this is political. You'd see a lot of people where you'd argue, hey, my guy didn't really do anything wrong here. You just don't like it. Well, we're going to give him 8 hours. And they would do that knowing that they had no appeal rights. They had to take the 8 hours. And of course, that went in your personnel file. You had an 8-hour suspension. So that was and to your point, Frank, I had the same thing happen where I repped a guy as a use of force. It should have been in policy. They found him out of policy. We went to the disciplinary review board. I said, screw it. I get to speak on his behalf as a union guy. I put on a whole nother use of force board presentation. And at the end of it, one of the people on the panel, it might have been a commander or an assistant chief, said, I'm not sure what we're doing here. I said, thanks. That makes two of us.
Right.
And so you try to find these little ways to do some end runs to, get something productive.
What we didn't talk about, not that we need to go into a big conversation about it, is that a lot of times there were some back room conversations going into some of these boards. I remember specifically repping an officer in use of force board where he actually grabbed a guy by his neck right at his Adam's apple because the guy just threw a bunch of drugs in his mouth and he was trying to swallow them.
Right.
Right. And, they had ruled out years ago that you can't use that, what they call the chicken choke in policy and all that.
Right.
But, they didn't have anything else in policy that says that what you do when that actually happens. So all through the, the process going through it, one of the commanders came to me and basically just said this. He said, listen, if you guys come into this use of force board with anything except for we apologize, I'm sorry what I did, I'll never do it again, I know it was against policy, that kind of a stature and that conversation, he said, I'm going to ask for his job, for him to be fired. And the case was very much one that we went in and after I had the conversation with the officer, I said, this is very winnable, I think. Well, I think we need to fight it all the way. And he was like, well, I don't lose my job. And I said, yeah, but he can't say that to us, right?
Right.
We're going to get a fair shake in this. And the truth is what he did is he grabbed him by the throat and then he punched him in the stomach. Well, one officer said he punched him in the groin. One said that he punched him in the chest. One said he punched him in the arm. And there was like all kinds of things, about it. But we went in there and we fought it the way we needed to, because there's no policy that tells you exactly what to do. He did the best he could. He's actually trying to save this guy's life.
Right, exactly.
And at the end of the day, what happened is they ended up giving him 80 hours off, but the commander did ask after we presented our evidence for him to be fired, and the board saw through it, and it basically gave him 80 hours off, and then we went from there to the next civil service board, and he got most of his time back.
Yeah.
So
yeah, those are the ones, because our policy book was 1,300 pages, and you still can't cover every conceivable thing that's going to happen out on the street, And so then it comes down to, well, and this is another one I love by senior command level people. Well, I would have never done it that way. when's the last time you were on the street, dude? 20,
Exactly.
20 years ago or more? And it's like, yeah, you probably would have tuned them up even worse. That's what you'd have done back in your day, but they get on these high horses and
Verbal judo. Why couldn't you have just talked him down?
use verbal judo.
Drop that knife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so anyway,
And so the other thing, so now after this whole, they get their discipline or everything's work out. Keep in mind, this is a very long and drawn out process, and it is for a number of reasons. Obviously, you have thoroughness of the investigation, but then also there may be potential litigation against the department, family of you shoot and killed somebody, the family might file a wrongful death lawsuit. But these incidents, they can sometimes take in excess of a year, year and a half. I mean, I recall incidents where the officer didn't go to the board until almost 2 years later. And you're like, okay, here we are 2 years later.
Which is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly.
But to be honest, it should never take that long.
That's just how it works. And the other thing is, what's very important for the officer is that clearance letter from the county attorney's office that says they are not going to be prosecuted. Because again, part of that criminal investigation and part of that includes the thorough report and any reports from a medical examiner, including an autopsy report.
Yeah. And I think a kind of interesting point, at least, in Arizona, and particularly where we serve, Maricopa County, which is the largest county in Arizona, by the way. Back several years ago, I talked to the then county attorney, and he said, and I said, hey, man, why is it taking so long to get clearance letters on these shootings? And he goes, man, I can't give one until I get the autopsy report from the EME's medical examiner. And he goes, sometimes they'll take 6 months to get their report to us. And I can't give a final clearance till I have every last piece of evidence. And what's interesting is police shootings are the only thing I'm aware of where a county attorney, at least in Arizona, will actually send out a letter saying, a formal written document, you've been cleared, there will be no criminal charges forthcoming. If you're Joe Citizen and getting a self-defense shooting and it gets reviewed and sent over, the only indication you get is something saying, we're not going to charge the case, but you're not going to get
at this time.
Yeah, at this time, you're not going to get like a framed certificate to put on your wall saying that you've been cleared. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But so wrapping up in summary, I think there's a few points we can talk about real quick here. And first of all, police shootings can take a lot of months to investigate and bring to a point of full closure. Now, something the general public just doesn't think about because they see a blurb on the 6 o'clock news, 5 minutes, officers were out of here, blah, 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 this happened, that happened, shots were fired, one person's taken to the hospital, he died, blah, blah, blah. And we all go on with our lives, got to go to work the next day. We don't care, whatever. Another point, cities, counties, and states will rapidly focus a lot of investigative resources on officer-involved shootings for the purpose of collecting and preserving evidence and documenting what was seen and heard through witness statements. Anytime a government agent, so police officers, county sheriffs, whatever, we're government agents. Anytime they pull the trigger and kill somebody, people want answers quick.
Right.
Politicians, mayors, city council people, the media, what happened, and they want to know relatively in short order, does this look good? Was it justified, or is this going to be a problem? And it's pretty easy to figure that out quickly. Again, police officers are subject to not one, but 2 investigations, the internal, administrative, but a criminal. So two parallel investigations running, and it can take months for both of them to come to conclusion.
I think anytime an officer, uses any kind of force or gets involved in a shooting, there's always a risk of criminal prosecution,
Yes.
especially this day and age. Everything's looked at pretty closely, and a lot of politics these days. So there's a lot of eyes on police officers.
Absolutely. Yes, there is. And listen, I don't think I think I speak for all of us, at least sitting here, that to say we're okay with the scrutiny. If you go into this job, you have to be okay with a high level of scrutiny because we're giving a high level of power that we can exercise up to and including taking a human life. So there needs to be high levels of scrutiny and accountability. We just want it, you want to be treated fairly through the process.
Right.
And that's what I used to tell people about union work. I said, even talking to new kids coming out of the academy, I said, listen, our job is not to get you off. Our job is to get you fair, to make sure the department treats you fairly. If you screwed up and did something wrong, you got to pay,
Right.
and we're going to try to help you navigate the process, to get you through it with minimal amount of damage, but you're still going to have to pay. The other key point, whenever an officer pulls a trigger, and you touched on it, Vic, there's always a risk of criminal and civil litigation. You can get prosecuted criminally. You can get sued civilly. There's a lot of risks there in the legal arena. And I think one that's really important, the point I wanted to make, is that contrary to popular belief, officers are not looking for opportunities to shoot. I've talked to citizens over the years. I said, I've never seen somebody leaving a police station going, man, hope this is the day I get to smoke somebody. What we're always hoping is, I hope this is a quiet, uneventful day, But stuff happens, and we are expected to run toward conflict while everybody else gets to run away. We're expected to run into the breach. We are expected to run toward the gunfire, the family fights, the crimes in progress. And sometimes it doesn't turn out well.
Yeah, you'd like to do your job and, just be humble, go about your day, get in, get out, and all that kind of stuff. But, I was involved with another sergeant when at a nightclub where the sergeant ended up, all four of us were potentially going to shoot the suspect who had a gun and had shot at some folks, but he shot and killed the guy. And it was about a 7-year process of, wondering if he's going to any criminal investigations and prosecution as well as civil. And we went, in fact, to civil court about 3 different times. So it involves a lot of stress and, a lot of issues, those kinds of things. And sometimes you end up having to fork out your own personal cash to make sure that you're protected, well, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think tied in with that is a key point that even if you get in a shooting and it's justified, a use of force or a shooting, there's still a lot of physiological and psychological stress that live in the aftermath of a shooting. After you pull the trigger, a lot of times things are just starting, right? We kind of touched on that, a little bit in the past hour here with everything we're covering about psychological fallout. You touched on some stuff that was very good. And, but stress impacts everybody different. And we talk about levels of resilience. Some officers can process stress really well. It kind of rolls off. And we'll see other officers where one shooting and they are mentally damaged to the point they can never return to work.
Yep. I mean, the very fact that, taking somebody's life and understanding, the capacity and what that involves. And, especially if you find out anything personally about maybe the person that was killed, it could have been, someone that had a mental health issue that, raised a gun, you shot and killed him. And you find out that he was struggling for a long time, beautiful family, things gone wrong, wrong place, wrong time. And, your world kind of collided with his, and you might have done the right thing in the shoot to protect yourself and others, but it doesn't mean that you feel well with that right now. We haven't even began to talk about like moral injury and those kinds of things.
Correct.
Right.
But there's a lot there. There's the mental health aspects of it, psychological, physiological as well as, morally, how you feel about what happens and those kinds of things. So,
Right, and that's something that literally, you have a quarter of a second to make a decision that's not only gonna affect you, but it's gonna affect others for literally the rest of your life.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And as we just talked about and touched on, post-traumatic stress is a very real thing. It impacts everyone differently. It can have debilitating effects to varying degrees. Um, you know, for some people will go get therapy and work through it, and they're okay. Um, you know, we talk about um, having to go see a psychologist post-shooting, and the and it typically within 3 days after a shooting, you'd go see the psychologist for just an initial sit down. And there was a guy in our department that was I think a SWAT guy that and with SWAT, there's much higher incidences with those guys getting in shootings because they're going and dealing
Sure.
with legitimate bad guys all the time, man, picking up felony warrants, hostage barricades. So those guys get in a higher proportion of shootings than than the typical patrol cops do. And this SWAT guy, he'd been on the SWAT for 15 years, and it's like as the story goes, his seventh shooting, and he went in to see the department psychologist, and he goes, "Well, is there anything that bothers you about this?" And he goes, "Yeah, I pulled the shot a little to the right, and it really bugs me, man. I think the psychologist's like, fuck you, man." It's like, but they had seen each other, they knew each other, and so that's part of the mental process of how we deal with stress.
Yeah,
You have to be able to put that stuff away and go, I'm just doing a job here, and not let it live rent free inside your head.
Yeah.
We took 2 different episodes to cover how a modern day police shooting is investigated, but old school, I've talked to old timers, and Frank and I were at a retirees breakfast a couple months ago and talking to a guy that he goes, "Yeah, I got in my shooting, and this is back when everybody's carrying revolvers, and I fired like 5 shots, and my sergeant came out and like, 'Oh, what happened?' And, give me your gun." And he took his empty shell casings and put them in his pocket. And the sergeant goes, "Well, I'm going to take your gun. I'm going to collect your gun, and here's my gun." And they traded guns. And he went home, and his wife, who's also a cop, said, "Well, how's your day?" And he said, "I threw 5 empty shell casings on the bed and said, that's how my day went." And I've heard stories about guys getting in shootings like early in their shift. Detectives come out, do a quick investigation and interview, and that guy was 10-8 on the street taking calls before the day was over. He was back out on the street.
Right.
And now we'll pull somebody out for 30 days for mental well-being.
Yeah. Well, I think we've taken a look at the process, and I think we all feel good about the fact that it's changed. The process has changed probably for the good, and but it's a pretty complicated process as it happens. But it's one of those processes that needs to be this way to ensure that there's integrity in the investigation and the entire process, and there could be some restored trust in public safety as you go through it. So,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and future topics moving forward, there's tons of topics we can hit on, but probably a biggie is post-traumatic stress, mental health, what you said, moral injury. We could dig into that in a podcast. We could one I'd like to do is maybe get a guest on here and then go into de-escalation, what it is, what it isn't. And then another biggie I've been seeing a lot on the news and related to police and law enforcement is the issue of qualified immunity. And
Yes, the old qualified immunity.
yeah, there's a lot of people out there screaming and yelling, going, well, we need to end qualified immunity for the police. I think a lot of people have misperceptions about what it is and what it isn't. A lot of them think it's a free pass to go out, commit murder, and never have anything happen. We all on this side of the table know that's absolutely not true, because cops get fired and prosecuted all the time for excessive force, for shooting when they shouldn't, for, it could be a manslaughter charge of shooting into a cluttered background and killing an innocent third party. I mean, so, and I think it's gotten, in the last decade, 10, 15 years, we've seen that get tightened up a lot, which, maybe it needed to be. But those are maybe some issues for, future topics.
Fantastic. Thanks for watching.
I would agree.
Yeah. If you guys enjoyed this, if you think that somebody could use the information or find it interesting, then click the like and subscribe button, and certainly forward the link to somebody you know.
And also feel free to let us know what you would like to see down the road, future episodes.
Sure. Yeah. If we get some good ideas from viewers, we'd certainly be willing to dive into it and certainly offer our opinions on it based on our training, education, and experience, and maybe give you some insights you didn't have before.